you had to know that when you write about this subject, you are moving into a sphere of great controversy and great incredulity. No matter what your credentials are, and no matter how many Pulitzer Prizes you have, and no matter how many degrees you have, it is a subject of enormous fascination, but also among a huge section of the community that's looked at that incredulity because of the people who say they have had these experiences. No one ever sees any evidence. Tell me how you got involved in this, and why is it of interest to you?
Well, in this culture, evidence has come to mean some physical object that we can measure, touch, take photographs of, and be certain of its pedigree, where it came from. But I suspect in something which is as unacceptable as a reality as this phenomenon, no piece of physical evidence would satisfy anybody. We'd be arguing that whoever found it was hoaxing it or making it up. But evidence can also come from other ways. Evidence can, in my discipline, psychiatry, and I've played my strong suit in doing this, is evidence that comes from clinical discrimination. And what I found was...
A discriminating look at clinical evidence.
Exactly. In other words, you look and you listen to what a person has to say about their experience, and you say, what could this be? And nothing in my 40 years of working with people prepared me for this phenomenon. In other words, what people were telling me with doubt, incredulity themselves. No one has, in spite of what critics say, anything to gain, as far as I can tell from this. Nobody wants to be a member of this club. They want to be found wrong, the people that have had these experiences. They want to be told this can't be.
They want to be told there's another explanation for what happened to you, and here it is, and therefore nothing's wrong with you, and you're not part of some...
And these are, exactly, and these are people of sound mind, healthy people. By and large, they've been traumatized, many of them, by these experiences, but they're reporting in great detail narratives that are highly similar, which they have not gotten from the media. Most of these details are not in the media. They come forth reluctantly. They know who to talk to and who not to talk to, which is not true of people who have delusions, you know, or have come up with something which is a reflection of a mental illness. And the only thing that I know that behaves like that is real experience, where something has actually happened to these people. Then the question is, what has happened?
Right.
And that's where I've taken it.
All right, but here...
Cultures from around the world have been describing extraterrestrial encounters and abductions for years. But the science community has labeled these experiences as sleep paralysis or lucid dreaming. John Edward Mack, an American psychiatrist, writer, professor, and former head of Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, believed there was something else going on. New York Times journalist Ralph Blumenthal joins me to discuss past psychology research around alien abductions in comparison with recent lucid dreaming studies and the work of John E. Mack. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Ralph, thank you for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. I've spoken to you many times with the debrief. Just happy to have you on my own show.
Thanks, Chrissy. A real pleasure to be with you.
Yes. I'd like to start off a little bit around the research that you've done with John Mack and a little bit about his life. And then we will get into past research psychology reports connected in comparison with today's lucid dreaming reports and research that has come out. So the first question I would like to ask you is, how did you come across John Mack's work, and what made you excited to get involved in researching him?
Okay, good question. This was new to me. I was a New York Times correspondent in Texas in 2004, and I just happened to come across this paperback book called Passport to the Cosmos, which turned out to be John Mack's second book. But I knew nothing about UFOs, alien abduction, John Mack. It was all new to me. I had read science fiction as a kid. That was basically it. But it was not a particular interest of mine. I'd written books about the mafia. I'd written about the Holocaust, Nazi war criminals, covered a lot of stories on corruption for the New York Times, investigative stories. But anyway, I came across his book by John Mack, and I thought it was very interesting that a Harvard psychiatrist would be interested in aliens. And interviewed a lot of patients who had these stories of, encounters with alien beings. So that's what got me started.
That's amazing. So out of all of the patients that he spoke to and the research that he did, what did he find so convincing? What was maybe the one or a few maybe stories or elements that he found was so convincing that made him become a believer?
Well, there were a few things. First of all, he heard the same kind of story from so many different people, otherwise normal people. These were, housewives and cops and professors and doctors and, a big cross section, old, young, men, women, and even children, 2 years old, who would tell stories about being taken up into the sky by little men. And these kids, he realized, hadn't seen movies about it. They hadn't read books about it. And after all, he was a very esteemed psychiatrist. I mean, he had written about nightmares. He had written about childhood development. He was really distinguished. All this was very strange to him. And he was hearing the same story over and over again from these people he was talking to. Some of them had scars they couldn't explain. In a few cases, there were third-party corroboration. People who there was a mother who had a sleepover with her daughter and a friend had a sleepover, and during the night the mother went down to check on them. The kids were not there, and she panicked, called the police. They searched everywhere, couldn't find the kids. The next morning they were back in their beds, and they remembered. They thought, they had a story that they saw a UFO outside the window. They had vague recollections of an abduction experience. So things like that all came together, and he could not find an explanation. And to this day, Chrissy, as you know, there is no explanation. But he approached it from the standpoint of a professional, a psychiatrist, who was looking for some easy explanation. These people were mentally ill or whatever, and he couldn't find it.
Yeah, and he risked his career, being a Harvard psychologist and people ridiculing him. How has his research today changed psychology currently?
Well, good question. I mean, in a way, the questions he raised are still with us. We don't know. And we'll get to the idea of lucid dreaming and the other explanations that have come up over the years. But none of the explanations are really satisfying. And he recognized that back then. So I think his work has stood up very well. His first book, called Abduction, was really case studies of 13 people. And he really interviewed them at great length with all his insights as a psychiatrist. And he went into their story. And, he was looking for things like sexual trauma. Did they have a history of, some kind of abuse? And nothing. I mean, nothing explained the fact that these people, this broad cross-section, were suddenly encountering these experiences, whatever they were, and not only at night, which we'll talk about. So it's not just a dream. It happened in the daytime. So I would say his work has held up.
Yeah, and I'd like to get into some past research around 1996, because that's the time that he was really active. He's been active for a while, in the early 90s as well. But 1996, I saw a lot of research around after he published his own journals and his own book, that we had other academics speaking to that and writing journals and papers. So in 1996, Psychological Inquiry Journal published an article called "The Construction of Space Alien Abduction Memories" by Stephen E. Clark and Elizabeth F. Lofus, both from the University of California, Riverside, and they were part of the Department of Psychology. So the research literature shows a reliable result has become known as the misinformation effect. They suggested that unidentified flying objects, UFOs, abduction memories are a variant of this misinformation effect on a very large scale. So what is your take on the misinformation theory? And then I'll ask you what your thoughts were around that, what John Mack would think. But what do you personally take from the 1996 comment of misinformation?
Okay, in my book, I looked at a lot of the explanations that were floating around, including Elizabeth Loftus's work and the other research into fake memories, reconstructed memories, etc. So none of this is new or surprising. And John Mack looked at it too. It does not answer the questions. I've got to say that. It raises some interesting points. For example, we were going to get to lucid dreaming, but how come these dreams are so particular about little men and little creatures and blue men, which comes up a lot. And I don't know the answer. No one knows the answer. I don't know why, but it's not the explanation for this phenomenon, this abduction phenomenon, because it doesn't fit all the different parameters. For example, the scars. There's some, I mean, it's not clear exactly where these scars came from. Like so much of this field, it's shrouded in some mystery. But again and again, these stories came up of people who remembered an abduction experience and afterwards had an unexplained scar. And as I said, these third-party corroborations. You know, there's something I dealt with in my book, The Believer, about a guy named Alvin Lawson, I believe, a professor who asked, and this was in, you know, Mack's time, and Mack dealt with this. He asked people to imagine an abduction scenario and just imagine it. And they came up with the most outlandish stories that's kind of matched real abduction stories. And he was asking them just to make it up. And sure enough, their stories seemed sort of eerily reminiscent of some of the actual abduction accounts. So he got some traction with that, Lawson, and Mack thought it was quite interesting. He wrote a paper about it, Mack did, after Lawson published his research. But in the end, he said, it's interesting, but it doesn't solve the mystery. It doesn't answer all the questions. Yes, it's interesting that people could make up stories that seem to match other abduction accounts, but it still leaves open the question of what happened to these people who had these experiences, not just at night, but in the daytime, the scars, third-party corroboration. So after all is said and done, the Susan Clancy work that she did for Harvard, Elizabeth Loftus, all the interesting and worthy research still doesn't take us where we need to get, and we may or may not ever get there.
Yeah. And unfortunately, you have people that are lying, you know, and there might be a small portion that are having, you know, they are confused with different memories or they're influenced by culture feedback loops. But then we have another portion that are monetizing and making money off this. You know,
Well,
Carl Sagan. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things that, you know, Mack kept dealing with was people saying, well, you know, these people are looking for fame. And he actually found the opposite, that people were terrified of talking about these experiences. They didn't know what had happened to them. You know, they would have this experience of you know, encountering you know, alien beings, being taken to a spacecraft, having different kinds of experiments done on them, reproductive procedures. Women had their eggs taken, they remembered, and men had their sperm taken, and all that. So they were not eager to spread the story around. They were terrified. So it's not as if these people were looking for fame. Now, there were books written about the abduction thing, so some people probably, you know, saw it as a way to get famous. But most of the abductees or experiencers, as Mack preferred to call them, because it's less judgmental, but most of these people were not looking for attention.
Yeah. And, you know, I think you had different scientists and people in the scientific community that didn't agree. You know, I have a quote here from Carl Sagan in '93 that he says, the pay dirt of space alien abductions accounts is not what they might tell us about alien visitations, but what they might tell us about ourselves. So did he ever work with Carl Sagan or speak to Carl Sagan about this? Because you can see that he doesn't feel, you know, there isn't an alignment here.
Yeah. He and Carl Sagan had a difficult relationship. It is interesting. I mean, Sagan, who was a great pioneer, and his you know, series on the cosmos broke all records, as you know. I mean, but he was a skeptic. I mean, no doubt about it. And Mack tried to get him, and John and Lawrence Rockefeller, who funded some of Mack's research, tried to engage Sagan in more discussion about it, but Sagan didn't want to get involved. It was, the third rail for him, abduction experiences. So, what he did in his scientific writing or so was laudable, clearly, but he certainly did not, get into the debate with John Mack about these abduction experiences. He dismissed a lot of it.
Yeah. Did any of John Mack's patients, not the children for sure, but anyone else that later came out and said that they were exploiting this topic and making money off it?
John Mack had one real debacle, which I talk about in my book. There was a woman who approached him and said that she'd had this extraordinary encounter on a spaceship with Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, and Fidel Castro and John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Mack, who had heard a lot of wild stories, kind of went for it. And he thought this was really interesting, and he asked her to elaborate. And she went on and on about this encounter she had with Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis on a spaceship. And then she turned on him and said she'd hoaxed him. And Time magazine wrote it up in a big way and saying, attacking John Mack and saying that he fell for this, which he did. He did kind of fall for it. But he then showed, and I talk about this at some length in my book, that this woman who hoaxed him probably had some experiences, because she started talking about them before she ever approached John Mack. And she had a very, very strange background of her own, which she talked about encountering beings and all that. So it's a very murky episode. But to answer your question, this was one case where somebody turned on him and said, she made it all up and tried to bring him down. She thought he was a cult leader and needed to be, exposed. And that was not what my research showed at all. In fact, that he was, a cult leader. He was really a scientist. He was trying to get at the bottom of a very intractable mystery. He was naive at times. He wasn't a perfect human being. He made mistakes, but his heart was in the right place. And to this day, we don't know what this phenomenon is all about.
Yeah. And we hear that people, like Betty and Barney Hill and Travis Walton might be looking to make, pay dirt money off this. What was his thoughts around, Travis Walton and the Betty and Barney Hill incidents?
I don't recall him saying much about Travis Walton, but Betty and Barney Hill, that occurred. It actually happened to them in 1961. It didn't come out till 65. There's a perfect example. They did not exploit it. Just to remind your viewers, listeners, that this was a couple in New Hampshire who were coming back from a belated honeymoon, driving through the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and they saw something up in the sky that seemed to be following them. And they looked through binoculars, and it looked like a spacecraft. And eventually their car stopped and wouldn't move, and they were taken by these little beings and put aboard this craft. And they remembered some of this afterwards, and other stories came out during hypnosis afterwards, but not for 4 or 5 years afterwards. They didn't talk about it. They talked about it to a small circle of friends, but it really got blown up big when John Fuller, a writer, got hold of their story and made it a big deal and wrote a book about it, became a movie. But so you could say that they were not looking to exploit this story. They were running away from it. In the end, it caught up with them. And they are the most famous abduction couple in history.
They are. And we see that, even now, people believe Travis Walton, and then we've seen mainstream media that have discredited him recently, and people saying that his story it's kind of gone back and forth. Before, people discredited him, and then people believed him, and now we've get to how people don't right now, and it is unfortunate.
That's an interesting case. I mean, a guy who he disappeared with friends in the woods, and then he showed up 5 days later and said he'd been taken by a spacecraft. And the story has gone back and forth. And recently some stuff came out that, seemed to discredit him. But I wouldn't put too much faith in that, in the new stuff, just because it didn't answer all the questions and it's controversial. I mean, look, the most famous case of all, which is coming up to, I think, the 75th anniversary, is Roswell.
Right.
Something crashed at Roswell. Whether the government said later it was a weather balloon. Initially, the Army itself said it was a flying disc. There were stories that alien bodies were recovered, that files disappeared. I mean, it is one of the murkiest episodes in all of history. But there's no clear explanation for a lot of the things that happened. So it's not as if we can say, oh, well, this settles it. You know, this is what really happened. We don't know. So a lot of these stories, because there are no, you know, there's no proof, there's no witnesses that are really credible, there's no videotape, there's no scientific, you know, collection of evidence afterwards. We have that now with UFOs, by the way. The Navy has credible information now, and put it out in a report last year that these UFOs actually physically exist. You know, that's different. But aliens, you know, we don't know.
Yeah. And again, what you said to the UFO comment in Roswell, you know, I don't think that the government, American government, or any government in that will even speak to past research, especially with the American government talking to Roswell. I think with the UFO office, we're not even going to get past comments on incidences like that. I think what we're probably going to get now is obviously stuff that's going to come out that's more in recent studies and in recent incidences.
Yeah.
I have another question about an academic paper as well. Psychologists Leonard S. Newman and Roy F. Bonmister, I'm going to probably say his name wrong, suggest towards, they had a paper called Towards an Explanation of the UFO Abduction Phenomenon, Hypnotic Elaboration, Extraterrestrial Sadomasochism, and Spurious Memories. That's what the journal was called. And it states that space alien abduction narratives are a variety of false memories reconstructed with the suggestion of hypnosis, details drawn from popular culture, and perhaps obsessed subcultures that is filled with images of space alien visitations. So my question to you, did John Mack ever look into the concept of cultural feedback loops? Because this is kind of what it's suggesting, is that somebody has an alien abduction experience, but they've seen something through popular culture that has suggested it, and then they have been projecting it. Did John Mack ever look at that theory? And then what was his thoughts on cultural feedback loops?
He did. Look, again, he was a distinguished academician. He had his faults. But he was no dummy. And it's not like somebody came up with a theory or someone told him something and he grabbed at it and you know, said that was his understanding. He really studied these things, and he really did look hard for another explanation than that this really happened. He was looking for all kinds of ways of discrediting, really, the people who were coming to him. You know, were they mentally ill to begin with? Was this some kind of cultural feedback? Was this a sadomasochistic dream? And that paper really concerned him, the one you referenced, and he wrote a rebuttal to it, a very long rebuttal, which he called Toward a More Parsimonious Explanation. In other words, a much simpler explanation, because some of the things that they were claiming, such as that these alien encounters were really sadomasochistic fantasies. And he studied this. I mean, this was his field, you know, psychiatry. And he ended up pretty much debunking it, saying that it didn't fit all the parameters of the available information. And again, there was fragmentary information, far short of scientific proof, but fragmentary information giving some credence to these recollections, or whatever you want to call it, memories that people had, and he tested them afterwards. He didn't only take it from hypnosis, by the way, because hypnosis is kind of a dubious practice, because it depends on the ability of the hypnotist to maintain a certain distance and all that. And John Mack knew that. So he didn't really go for hypnosis in a big way. He retaught himself hypnosis As a psychiatrist, he'd studied it and then he didn't use it, and then but he didn't use it much. He really used relaxation techniques. So what he didn't want to do was implant ideas in people. And by the way, Betty and Barney Hill's psychiatrist, who was another esteemed psychiatrist, who had written about post-traumatic stress disorder from the veterans of World War II. He really had a distinguished record. He himself was mystified after talking to Betty and Barney Hill for years and years and trying to understand. And in the end, he couldn't bring himself to believe that they'd really been abducted, but he didn't have any other explanation. So roundabout answer to your question, Mack he was aware of, these other studies of this work, that tried to fit these experiences into something we recognize, like mental illness or fake memories or implanted memories, all these things. But in the end, those explanations didn't fit all the points it would need to fit to be a viable, hypothesis.
Yeah. Did he ever think about his own work? And I ask this, I find cultural feedback loops fascinating personally, and even in the psychology space. Did he ever think about his own work feeding back into that loop? Because we always look at everybody else's work and we look at popular culture, but if we're contributing to it, do we ever evaluate what we're doing and what we're giving into obviously history and into those cultural feedback loops? Like, what was his perception on his own work?
I have an anecdote in the book that kind of speaks to this particular issue. He was down near Australia trying to do some field work with one of his assistants. And he wanted to find an untouched part of the world to see whether the abduction phenomenon was really universal, which, by the way, it is. I mean, you have stories from Brazil, you have from, all over the world. Different cultures have had these similar accounts going back through history and prehistory. Anyway, so he went to this tiny little place in the Arafura Sea, and he didn't even know how to begin to find the people to interview. So he and his assistant just sat in the middle of this tiny little village, and they waited for people to come over to him. And when they did, because he didn't want to alarm them, they eventually formed a circle around him, and he introduced himself. He said, "Hi, I'm Professor John Mack from Harvard. I come from the United States, and and I'm here to ask you about whether you have any stories about little people, and encounters." And they all chimed up. Yeah, they'd seen all the TV, they knew all the stories, they'd watched the movies, they'd seen the TV shows. And he was astounded. I mean, there goes his perfect research, So to answer your question, yeah, there is this feedback. He was aware of it. He knew he was feeding into it by all the work he did, because he was stimulating more of it by talking about it. But his position was that he wasn't making this stuff up. It was there. He was bringing it to the surface by acknowledging it and getting people to talk about it. But it had been in cultural histories, strange encounters like this, that the folklore people had been recording for thousands of years, and ancient analysts have been recording for thousands of years. So he wasn't concerned that he was implanting this idea that had never occurred to anybody before he showed up. He was, it would have been a nice thing for him to find, but he was too smart for that. He knew that it did not settle the question.
Yeah, I'm glad that he was even just self-analyzed his own work and what he was giving back to society and into culture as well, because it's obviously really important, because he's playing a major part in it, especially when you're doing major mainstream interviews and traveling around the world speaking about a topic that is so sensitive. I want to get into now recent studies of lucid dreams. So they say that about 55% of people experience lucid dreaming once or more in their lifetime, and 23 have lucid dreams at least once a month. So there was a research study done with those called the Phase Research Center. And it conducted experiments with 152 adults who self-identified as lucid dreamers and they were instructed to find or summon aliens or UFOs during a lucid dream. The scientific reported was reported on July 2nd, and it was done in the International Journal of Dream Research. And so the research found that out of 144 of the participants reported dreaming about having some type of successful interaction with an extraterrestrial, and then 61% described meeting aliens that resembled extraterrestrials from a science fiction novel, and while 19% met aliens that looked like ordinary people. So this says a lot right now about what lucid dreaming was, and I should ask you even too, what was John Mack's research within lucid dreaming? Because we're seeing these studies now that people are getting really affected by cultural feedback loops, and from what we're seeing, that could be affected by cultural feedback loops. And this study does really parallel with that. What would John Mack say, or even yourself, what do you say to these kind of studies now that are recent and have been coming up that are not in line with the abduction theory?
Well, he looked at everything. I mean, he answered everything. He took it as a professional challenge. He did not shrug it off and say, "Oh, you know, they're full of it," or you know, "I don't believe it," or whatever. He struggled to understand. Look, he was looking for another explanation, which he never found, other than that something had really happened to these people. But he was looking for some key to unlock this mystery. He would have been very happy to find it, I think. Well, I think the first thing he would say is that, well, it's very interesting that there's this parallel between these images that these people have in their dreams and what the abduction accounts people have given. But first of all, how would this theory explain the people who have had abduction experiences? Not at night during sleep. They were driving in their cars. Betty and Barney Hill were not sleeping and dreaming. They were driving through the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Now, you know, I guess you could make up a scenario where they were falling asleep at the wheel and then they had this dream. Well, if that was the case, the car probably would have run off the road and, you know, and wrecked. And so many other people have had these experiences in broad daylight. Now, Kerry Mullis, who was a Nobel Prize winning chemist, who won a Nobel Prize for reproducing DNA for study, had an experience that he wrote about in his own book, where he had a country house in Mendocino, California, and one night after work he drove there by himself, and he got there, stowed his luggage, went out to check something in the back with a flashlight, and the next thing he knew, he saw something along the road. He shined his flashlights. It was a raccoon, a glowing raccoon, and the raccoon spoke to him. And the raccoon said, "Good evening, doctor." The next thing he knew, he says in his book, it was the next morning. He was walking along the road. His clothes were dry. He didn't know how he got on the road, what had happened. He remembered the night before, no sign of the flashlight. He never figured it out. And his daughter called him he said, and she told him she just had a similar experience at the house, that she was walking along the road, you know, she found herself on the road, she didn't know how she got there, etc. So look, this is a Nobel Prize winning chemist. He was not asleep at night having a lucid dream. He was walking outside his country house. It's just an inexplicable episode, like so many of them. And John Mack would say so many of these accounts occur during waking hours. So how can we relate it to a lucid dream? He would say, look, I wrote a book on nightmares. He says, I know what a dream is. I'm a Pulitzer Prize. He wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Lawrence of Arabia. So he had a Pulitzer Prize to his credit. He says, look, I know what a dream is. I know what dreaming is. I wrote a book about nightmares. These weren't nightmares, not all of them anyway. So it's intriguing that these people, that there was this correlation between the images that they came up with during lucid dreaming and the images that people, discussed from their remembered encounters with alien beings. But it doesn't take us everywhere we want to go. It's just intriguing. Now, I think the answer is more study of the brain, okay? That research is necessary. I and John Mack and other serious people who've studied this, who've looked into this, are not enemies of science. We want the science. We think that there should be more science on this, not less. And we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, with the James Webb telescope to look for black holes. That's great. We should. And the collider, under the ground in Switzerland, great. Looking for elusive particles that explain the, 85% of matter we don't know in the universe. Energy, dark energy, dark matter. We don't know anything about that. Great. Let's look for those particles. But let's also study these experiences from a scientific point of view and try to understand what's going on in the brains of these people that might help shed light on it.
Yeah, and you actually took the question I was going to ask you. What kind of research would you like to see?
Yeah. Well, Gary Nolan is doing it. Gary Nolan
Yes.
at Stanford is doing it, and Diana Pasulka, who's a religion scholar in North Carolina, she's looked into this too from a religious point of view, and she's confronted the mystery of these visions, these religious visions that people have had for so many years. And the sighting at Fatima, in Portugal, was a mass sighting some years ago, where hundreds of people saw something materialize. So, and these people they're not enemies of science. They're saying, let's study it. Let's put some of the billions of dollars that we put into researching other mysterious phenomena into this.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to go back though, also to these, and I didn't ask you this before, but I wanted to, about, we look at Leonard S. Mister and Roy F. Stephen E. Clarkson, Elizabeth F. Fultis, like the psychologists that were doing research and were saying that what John Mack was speaking about wasn't correct. What was his relationship with these psychologists as he moved through his own career?
He engaged with them. I mean, he was always willing to debate them. To those who came up with hypotheses while he was around. By the way, he was run over in London in 2004, which was right after I discovered his book, which is what got me into it. I read his book and thought this would make an interesting story, and then he was dead. I mean, he was run over in a drunk driving accident in London. But he didn't shy away from these people. He tried to understand too. And as I said, he debated some of them. Some of them came out after he died, so he wasn't around to engage with them. But those he was aware of, he said, "Look, it's fine to come up with a hypothesis, but it's got to fit the data as we know it." And the data was that some of these things happened in broad daylight. In one case, it was a woman driving a snowmobile who had an encounter. She wasn't asleep. She was driving a snowmobile. She woke up with her clothes piled up next to the snowmobile, folded neatly. She remembered some kind of an encounter with spacecraft, alien beings. I don't know, most of the time these things are clouded. They're not crystal clear memories, which is another indication, by the way, that these people are not making it up, because if they were making it up, they'd make up every detail. Yeah. But they say, I don't know, my mind, memories are like wiped. So, but Mack, he was respectful of people who engaged with him, who came up with competing hypotheses. But in the end, he said, science is science, and it's got to match the data. And if you can't account for all the things, like it didn't happen at night, it happened to little children who don't have cultural feedback, and they remember these things. It seemed to run in families, by the way, for some reason that no one is able to understand. It happened mainly to people in their childbearing years. It's another phenomenon. You know, you have to tick off all the things, the data, you know, that describe this phenomenon, and then find, does your solution or so-called solution match the data? And if you say, well, it's these people are trying to get famous, well, what about the people who are struggling to avoid you know, being identified? People have been watching too many movies. Well, little kids don't watch movies. What about the scars? What about the patterns of UFO activity? Very often, these abduction experiences are in conjunction with a UFO. Not always, but often, okay? So sometimes outside the window where people remembered they saw a UFO, there is some disturbance, physical disturbance to be seen. The grass is pushed down, tree branches are broken. It's not like the ground, that there's any strong indication on the ground of what happened. No, there isn't. Again, this is part of the mysterious nature of the phenomena. It's not like suddenly there's a different chemical composition to it's not that way. But all these things are data points that have to be addressed in any hypothesis. So that you know, he would say to all these people, fine, give me your explanations and we'll consider it.
Yeah, and I agree. Like, more research needs to be done on the brain and consciousness and connected to what's happening here. What would John Mack, and this is my last question, what would John Mack say about simulation theory? Because I believe when simulation theory really started, he wasn't around, I believe, and I might be wrong, that during his time, that wasn't a consideration in science. What would he say now? Because it's a really, really strong theory. I believe they say that it's 50% that we can be in a simulation or that we're not. What would he say with simulation theory in connection with alien
we are not, that
abductions?
this is not even reality, that this is all
So, yeah, it's all a simulation. Yeah.
It's a hard one to argue
It is.
with.
I wish John was here.
But you know, he'd probably say, I'll look at, you know, any data. I'll, you know, this is the only reality we know. You know, he had a running debate with Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who were the two other people he worked with, and he eventually distanced himself from, because Bud Hopkins and Jacobs were very wedded to the idea that these abduction experiences were happening in absolute reality. These really were happening to people, and David Jacobs in particular found them very sinister, that these aliens were taking DNA or reproductive material to breed a hybrid race, and there were hybrids walking around and all this, and they want to take over our planet. And so John Mack eventually distanced himself from that, saying, I don't know what reality this is happening. It's not everyday reality. We know that because it's not happening outside. We can see it. If it's happening in some other liminal area of reality where that we don't understand. We don't have the mathematics. We don't have the physics to understand. It's certainly real to the people who are experiencing it. It's unforgettable. These people, when this is what helped convince John Mack that something real had happened. When they recounted these experiences, they were in terrible distress. They were weeping and crying and gnashing their teeth, and it was all extremely real to them. And Mack said, "Look, I'm a psychiatrist. These people are not making this up. They're not acting. That's for sure. They are real. They are really recounting something that they certainly believe happened to them." So, you know, whether this is what kind of reality this is, he would say, "What, you know, who knows? Anything is possible." But we can only go with the data we have. And he really was a scientist. I mean, he as I say, he made mistakes. He was gullible. He He was very tormented by his biography. His mother died when he was 8.5 months old of appendicitis. He was always missing her. Maybe that's why he reached out to the cosmos for some, other loving force out there that would help him overcome his loss. There's something that was operating, which he recognized. Being a good psychiatrist, he analyzed himself. I think he would go wherever the data would take him. And if we are a giant simulation and nothing is real, he'd pursue that.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. I agree. I think we have to be sensitive to the topic too, in many ways, because people, if these experiences for them are real, and that's what matters. And it's also very traumatic. So if it's abductions or it's not, I think we do have to have some science that looks at it to help people out in this area, to give them some empathy and understanding of what's going on with them.
And these people, they are getting together in abduction groups, group therapy sessions, and they meet with each other. But as far as I know, science hasn't really attached itself to them for serious study, because it's disreputable in some way, and that's a shame. But if the scientific establishment said, look, we really want to understand these people and see what are their brains different from, why are some people having abduction experiences and not other people? That's a question that John Mack asked himself, and that we need to ask. Why some people and not other people? What is it about these people that picks them out, or that they pick themselves out somehow? Or what is it that defines them? We don't know. So far, they're not different from anybody else that we can see. So anyway, a lot still to be looked at.
Yeah, it is. There's tons of it. And I also just think that the UFO conversation was so fringe, and now it's become mainstream. This might open up a conversation within the science community to be able to look at this too at some point, and not so ridiculed that it has been over the years.
Yeah, ridicule is a big factor. And it's
Yeah.
a shame, because people are afraid to go into it because they're afraid of being ridiculed. And now finally the government is saying, yeah, these UFOs, whatever they are real. We don't know who's behind the wheel, or what they're doing here, or why, or anything. But we know now that they exist. They're not figments of the imagination.
Yeah, you're right. Ralph, where can we get your book, The Believer? And I believe it's on audiobook already, and it's in hard copy as well, and it's a digital book as well. Am I missing anything?
And it came out in paperback this week.
Awesome.
Actually, 1 year to the day since hardcover. A lot is on my website, www.ralphblumenthal.com. It's in bookstores, it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's, as you said, it's digital, it's Kindle, it's audio, it's everywhere. You can't avoid it.
That's awesome. Do you narrate it too? Do you narrate the audiobook?
No,
I wish you did.
Oh, thank you. No, they got a professional reader and actor, very good, does a very nice job. And I do hear from a lot of people who say, I have bad eyes, I can't read. I listen to books, and when they would always ask me, when is the audio book coming? I say, well, it's out now. So it's easy to get, and all you have to do is Google it, The Believer, and I hope you enjoy it.
Awesome. Thank you, Ralph. And thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Thank you. Great to see you, Chrissy.
Good to see
Bye-bye.
you too.
Be well.
Bye.